Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. Today is an encore presentation of my conversation with author Anne Ma, who has written Kitchen Chinese, The Lost Vintage, and Instantly French. I'm really happy to re-release this conversation because I'm a huge fan of Ma's and I really love her work, and I can't be enthusiastic enough about her books, and I'm looking forward to her next one this year. We are re-releasing this podcast episode to honor Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Asian American food writing has persisted and come onto its own and pays tribute to a variety of voices within a vast and diverse community. Here is a representation of just a few of the many Asian American food writers you can read and follow. To find out more about Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, go to the below website link on the bio for this episode. Without further ado, I'm going to take you now to my Encore presentation conversation with author Anne Ma. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. Today I'm talking to author, food writer, Anne Ma. Anne has written such books as Kitchen Chinese, The Lost Vintage, The Art of French Eating, and more. Anne, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Dean.
Now, it's really weird to be talking to you because I've been living in like the space of your books for the past several months. And the thing that I love about your books is that the characters become real. And it's like when you watch a TV show for several seasons, and then you really get to love the characters, and then the show ends and you're like, but what about this person? What about that person? And it's like, you're such a wonderful writer in that you really make characters that I become invested in. Even some of the characters that I didn't really care for, you become like, you're like, what happened to that person? What are they doing now? And it's just really kind of like sticks with you. And that's such a real blessing to have things, because it creates a Moorishness, I think, about the books where you want to go back and read them again and again. So thank you for the pleasure you give me over the past several months with some of your books.
Well, that's really, really nice of you to say. And I am really honored that you read them all.
Oh,
I think maybe only my husband and my parents could say the same.
That's not true. I talked to many people who've read your books. So yeah, there definitely a lot of fans out there. Now, where did writing start for you? When did you know were you a kid that was writing, or when did you know that you wanted to write?
I was definitely a kid that was writing, but I also grew up as the child of an immigrant, at least one immigrant parent. My mom was born in China. My dad was born in California. So there was that influence to have a profession, a career outside of the home, and that takes place in an office or a hospital or what have you. I always dreamed of writing, but after college, I went into book publishing, which I also really loved and had dreamed about doing. I worked at Penguin before they merged with Random House in New York. And that is where I eventually met my husband, who is a Foreign Service officer. He works for the State Department. And so his career requires him and us to move every 3 or 4 years. So once we got married, a month later, we actually moved to Beijing, China. I did give up my job as an editor at Penguin, which was really sad and hard for me because I loved what I did. But as I learned about Beijing more and grew more comfortable speaking Chinese, I started working for an English language expat magazine called The Beijinger. And I was their dining editor. And so I would do reviews of restaurants. We would also had like a cooking column, and would, have interviews of local people on their regional cuisine. And that was basically how I started writing. And it was through that time living in Beijing for 4 years that I had the idea for my first novel, Kitchen Chinese.
Now, does some of what you've been saying kind of strikes me? I'm like, did you use some of that when you wrote Kitchen Chinese? Does some of this get used as kind of like parts of the main character's life, like Isabel, like how like she worked for a magazine, etc.?
Definitely. It's absolutely a roman à clef loosely based on my experiences living in Beijing. So like me, the main character was working in New York publishing, and she actually gets fired from her job and goes to Beijing to live with her sister, where she encounters opportunities and difficulties that she never could have imagined.
The mysterious Claire. Yeah, I love the characters. I loved Isabel. She seems so human and really relatable. And I mean, I just loved, I loved even Jeff, who's kind of like, I think there are terms people use for Jeff, but like he's just a young guy, and he's kind of,
Mhm.
yeah, kind of dumb. And like the mothers, everybody, like there was such a rich, even like the publisher, like the guy, I think he's Australian, everybody in there, it's just all these great characters. Were any of them like taken from like real life, like people that you knew, or did you just create them all?
They were definitely drawn from types of people I had met in Beijing, but they were all sort of composite characters, I would say, of people I knew, people who were kind of, Beijing um, expat celebrities, and then just developing the character as made sense in the story.
You really seem to take great pains to make your characters not cliche. Like every character, if they're not a great character, they have some humanity. If they're like if they're not a good person, you still give them some humanity. The good characters still have some flaws. Did you really try and create a balance with that to make it more realistic?
I mean, people are, well, I mean, generally speaking, most people are not black or white, terrible or good. I think most people, although, recently with the news, like Vladimir Putin possibly is not included in this description,
Yeah, yeah.
but most people are some gray scale of their wants and needs and things that have hurt them in the past. So I absolutely try to keep that in mind, but you're very, very kind to say that they're not cliche. It's something I think all writers, all novelists, all fiction writers try to avoid is the cliche character.
One thing that like I think that Isabel and Kate have in common from your two books is that they're characters that are kind of fish out of water. They're from America, but they're living in another culture. Does that like resonate from you with your life moving around quite a bit? You're often kind of the fish out of water.
I hadn't thought of it that way before, but absolutely. I've lived in a few different countries, France, China, most recently Vietnam. And yes, it is, one thing I think that is sort of universal for both my characters and me is that, when you live in another language, you're in your own bubble the whole time. You can be walking down the street and not really understand what anyone is saying, not understand any of the advertising that's in the subway, not understand, any of the signs. And that can be very alienating. Yes.
I I have to ask this question because I am such a fan of Kitchen Chinese. Is there going to be a sequel, do you think, at any point?
You're not the first to ask. I sometimes think about what Isabel is doing. But as for now, probably not. But I would love to write again about the Chinese American or Asian American experience in some form.
I what do you think Jeff is doing right now, years later? Do you think
So in the book, Jeff is he's like a pop star, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So I actually did meet when I was living in Beijing. I interviewed for an article someone who is similar to Jeff, a young guy who had been born and raised in America, in the United States, but moved to China. He was Chinese, ethnically Chinese, moved to China to pursue his music pop star dreams because he or his managers or maybe his parents were helping him finance it, felt that it was easier for him to get a start there than in the States, which may have been true, especially, this was in the early 2000s. So really before K-pop became big here in the States, and there weren't that many Asian American musical artists. So I haven't heard anything about him since. For Jeff in the book, I really would think maybe he retired from the musical life to help out, I will use that term loosely, in his family's business, and is now living like in a California suburb or a Atlanta suburb or something like that. Sort of living off his parents' dime, but has maybe a couple of kids.
He's such an intriguing character. He kept popping up and he made me laugh so many times because he's such a bro. And it's just like, dude, it's like, come on.
Yeah, I definitely had fun creating that character.
Now, has anybody talked to you about would you make this into a TV series if that came up?
I mean, I would love it. There was very early on interest that has sort of petered out, but I don't know. I mean, this book was published in 2010, and it was written in, it's very of that decade. I think I moved to Beijing in 2003, I believe. And so maybe if it was modernized quite a bit. I haven't been back to Beijing since I lived there. So I would definitely have to go back and see how things are for young and hopeful and creative expats living there now, which is what my main character was.
Yeah, I would love to. It would be a great. If anybody's listening to this and has that power, this would be the best TV series. Has to be a thing. The Lost Vintage was a book that really, I listened to it as an audiobook. So I would listen to it going to work. And the thing is, like with audiobooks, it's not like you have it in your house usually, unless you take it in here with you, or unless it's on your phone. It would be in my car and I would have to stop and like park and get out. And there's times especially when you're getting towards the end, you're like, oh, I gotta like, so I had to get it as a book because it was just, I couldn't keep putting it down because it was like, you get to points where you're like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Because it's like, it's not like against the clock, but like, there's definitely that thing where there's kind of a sense of urgency towards the end where something's going to happen. And like in both of the timelines of the book. So I read that you were volunteering for the wine harvest in France. Was that how you got the idea for this book?
Yes. Lost Vintage is very different from Kitchen Chinese. Mainly because Kitchen Chinese is set in China. Lost Vintage is set in France. So I really thank you so much for pointing out to me the similarities between the two characters, because that had never occurred to me before. And that's definitely something I'm going to be thinking about. Lost Vintage, I had volunteered to pick grapes in the wine harvest in Champagne. And I also wrote a travel article about it. But the experience was so unusual. I stayed in the vineyard house, which was the owners of the vineyard lived elsewhere. So it was sort of an empty, rambling house with wallpaper peeling from the walls and everything. The apartment I was in, was like a house, but it had been divided into little apartments, and the part I was in had been untouched or furnished, decorated in the 1960s or 70s. And so the bathroom was salmon pink, and there were, the floorboards were creaky, and the electricity definitely needed redoing. It was very flickery. And it was very easy to feel like the space was haunted. Which I wrote about a little bit in my travel article, but the more I thought about it, the more sort of a connection between the land and what the land had witnessed over the centuries And that feeling of ghostliness grew in my imagination.
This episode is sponsored by Culinary Historians of Northern California, a Bay Area educational group dedicated to the study of food, drink, and culture in human history. To learn more about this organization and their work, please visit their website at www.chnorcal.org. One of the things I liked about the book is there was a book within a book. And so you're getting kind of two books for the price of one in many ways. And they're interconnected through a series of it's not a time travel story at all, but there's this sense of kind of the past and the future merging in many ways. So I was really just thrilled by this book. And I just, like I said, there's a sense towards when you get halfway through it, you start picking up the pace where you're just going, you could feel the tension. If it was a film, there'd be high tension music and stuff like that. It was just really, but the thing that I was really struck by was that I love history and I like reading about history. And I often feel like nobody really gets a good sense of what the French went through during the war. I get so angry because I really have studied real history. And when I hear people brag about America getting into the war, which is a bunch of BS because we really lagged in that regard. And then coming in and rescuing France, which that's debatable. So when people talk about that stuff, it makes me mad. And then when they call the French surrender, whatever they say about the French derogatorily, I'm like, well, you didn't know what it was like, and we don't have that experience in America. We can't compare.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel that ever? It wasn't really fair how some Americas arrogantly come to France and brag about how we say them during the war. It just makes me mad. Did you kind of feel that at all?
Well, I've always admired very, very much the French resistance and the idea of resistance during the war in Europe. And I think that is a huge part of the story. As you mentioned, the book, it's a dual timeline. So there's a main character who is in the present day, and then a main character who is writing a diary during the war. She's a teenage girl writing a diary during the war. So what interested me was this idea of resistance and this idea of what happened to women during the war, because there's a lot of historical fiction about it coming out now, but wars are mainly written by men, the stories of war. So that was really the inspiration for the book, especially how women were treated after the liberation. I don't want to give away any spoilers, but the idea of really the agony and the reckoning of France after the liberation and the pain of that.
Well, yeah, and there were people that probably collaborated but didn't want to be seen as collaborators. So they would shift the blame to somebody else. We always see these depictions of how women were treated after the war and shaving their heads and parading through the streets and stuff like that. But you don't know their real stories or what they went through. And we often don't have perspective. We think of they may have had modern inconveniences, but they were probably not. They were probably malnourished. They were probably going without medical treatment. We don't know what it's like to live during an occupation. And
exactly. Yeah.
So were you that aware of World War II history? Did you have to kind of go through a crash course studying World War II history when you wrote this?
It was really living in France that made me more aware of World War II history. We moved there for my husband's work at the embassy. And one of the first things that we did, one of the first weekends we were there, he was asked to go to a little village in the Loire Valley which was commemorating the anniversary of a German attack on it. It was right around the liberation when the Germans just sacked the village and burnt it to the ground. And, growing up in the suburbs of Southern California. Nothing like that had ever occurred to me that could happen. Yet here it was, this village, still thinking about it, still hurting from it, still commemorating it, still gathering to talk about it. So that was really eye-opening for me, that the war was still present, even though, it was 75 years later.
Was it hard for you to translate the idea to most Americans? So when we think of wine, we buy it at Trader Joe's, we get 3 or 4 bottles. It's not really a big deal to us. But in France, it's a heritage. It's like a legacy. And you were talking about a family who had this legacy, this lost vintage. Was that hard for you to translate? Do you think everybody got it? I felt like any reader who read your book would get it, but did you feel like that would be a difficult task to take on?
Definitely. And that's one of the things I love about France the most, is this connection between the land and the history and the food and wine, that a dish is formed because of its geography, and also because of its history. So I think America is wonderful in that we're always welcoming new people and these new from different countries, and immigrants are bringing in new flavors and new traditions, and they're all sort of merging and melding, and new things are coming out of that. Yeah. I think that is equally fantastic and wonderful. But that is also very different from what is in France, where they're traditional, very attentive to protecting those traditions, and very protective.
You've had some great characters in this. I really loved the characters. And like with Kitchen Chinese, a lot of the characters stuck with me after the fact. Kate is a great character, and I really love Jean-Luc. He was just I really felt so sorry for him and his heartbreak and what he must have been going through. It was one of the few male characters I've ever encountered that I really felt empathy for. I just want to buy him a beer and go, it's okay, man, this is going to get better. Just wanted to was it hard writing a male character like that?
I think Jean-Luc is the love interest of Kate, the main character in the contemporary timeline. And their story is one of young love that peters out because of, I guess, societal expectations on women, right? Jean-Luc, when they were young, really expected her to marry him and take care of the home and their kids while he went out and did the vineyard work. And she was not interested in that type of insular role.
Yeah.
I think Jean-Luc was actually quite hard to write because, it's hard to switch to enter into the perspective of a man. You're very, very kind to say those nice things about him. I wonder, if I could have done a better job with him or explored him a little more.
No, you did a great job. He was wonderful. Really good job with that. I was going to ask you, you've written a lot about food in your writing, Kitchen Chinese had a lot of food in it, and doing the restaurant reviews and stuff like that, going to restaurants. There was a lot, food played a big role, as did, of course, in The Lost Vintage. Is it harder to write food writing or write fiction with food in it? Is it equally hard, or is one more hard than the other?
They both have challenges. I do think, because I wrote a cookbook, a French cookbook for the Instant Pot. It's called Instantly French.
Yes.
So working on that was my first time really diving into a project of developing recipes and testing recipes and, that sort of very scientific process of recipe writing. It is very difficult physically, and you are buying a lot of food and cooking a lot of food and honestly giving away a lot of food.
Yeah.
And that's challenging. But in terms of being mentally taxing, to me, nothing is as difficult as fiction.
Now, I really enjoyed Mastering the Art of French Eating, Lessons in Food and Love from a Year in Paris. You just had some wonderful chapters in it. I really like how you kind of outline like your life there as kind of somebody who's I don't want to use the word stranded, but I'm trying to think you're kind of like plunked in France, which would be wonderful, I think, for many people, but it was kind of a lonely thing for you because your husband wasn't always there. When you were writing the one chapter I really enjoyed where you're hunting down the origins of a buckwheat crepe, I think called a galette, was that?
Mm-hmm,
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
I really love that part because you're kind of like a food detective. What was that like for you, that experience? If you want to kind of relate to that to the listeners.
So I, like I was saying, I love this connection between history and place and a recipe, how a recipe grows out of that. And so the buckwheat galette, I had not really encountered before I moved to Paris. It wasn't something I had thought about, but in France, a savory crepe or crepe is made from buckwheat flour, which has a really distinct nutty, grainy, hearty taste, flavor, and texture. And I was really curious about why. So I, went out to Brittany and rented a car. I got horribly lost trying to find a dairy farm. I just remember driving around in circles for hours and trying to call the woman. I was so late and trying to call her on my cell phone, but there was no cell phone service, and just this, that terrible feeling of panic when you're late and lost and just in the middle of a field. But what I loved about it was meeting the people who produced buckwheat and who produced the butter, the cultured butter from cultured cream, which is so important to the region, and learning about their products. And also the region of Brittany is unusual in France because it's not a wine producing region. They drink cider there. It's too cold to grow grapes there. The climate is just not right. So in terms of, gastronomically, it's a little bit unusual compared to the rest of the country. So yes, that was one of my favorite chapters to write. And I just loved, meeting people and then getting a tip from them for someone else to meet, and getting a phone number and making contacts and interviewing and just learning. It was really a wonderful, enriching experience.
I want to ask you, who are some of the food writers that you enjoy that have been an inspiration to you through the years?
Let's see. I really love Julia Child, of course. Her book, My Life in France, really, I read that. It came out, I guess, when I was living in Beijing before I ever moved to France. And I read it and just dreamed of living in Paris, with, because she also was the wife of a diplomat. I felt like her experiences were she was so honest about them and clear, and she persevered. She was such a hard worker, and she really didn't give up. I really admired that. And of course, her food writing also is marvelous. I think that Mastering the Art of French Cooking could be read as like a guide to France itself, with the way she covers all the different regions.
Absolutely. Now, I want to ask you a question, just personally, because I live here in the Bay Area, and the Lost Vintage has some shout outs to bits of the Bay Area. You talk about driving past Berkeley and being in UC Davis and being in the city. Do you get to spend much time here in the Bay Area? And if you do, what are some places you like to go to eat?
I do not. I am from Southern California, so I and I'm a Southern Californian who has always admired Northern California. My husband went to college at San Francisco State, so he is really my Bay Area guru,
Mhm.
personal guru.
Okay.
And my dad spent a lot of time at UC Davis.
Nice.
Yeah.
Great school.
So, yes. And so I guess the parts of the book that mention those places are sort of in homage to hearing them talk about them so fondly, their times at Davis, my dad, and for my husband, his times in San Francisco. I took a trip there a few years ago, and I loved eating at the Slanted Door.
Yeah, great place.
So good. I was with my parents, and we did like a eating tour of San Francisco. So we went to all the hot spots, Zuni Cafe, which was
Nice.
also amazing, and Slanted Door. Such a great dining room too they have there. I love the Ferry Building.
The Ferry Building is magical.
Mm-hmm. And then we also went to Chez Panisse, which was a really huge treat.
Oh, it's the best. Oh yeah, we've had a lot of chefs from there on the show, and they're just so fun to talk to them about their time there. Well, actually, on that same note, being a Southern California and living abroad, what do you miss? What are the things you really ache for when you're living abroad from California?
Oh, I love See's candy.
Ah, yes.
Who
doesn't?
I guess who doesn't really? And I love Paris chocolate shops as well, but to me, there is nothing like a See's caramel or yeah. So my parents always get a box of nuts and shoes at the holidays, and it's really one of my favorite parts of going home for the holidays. I love In-N-Out.
Yeah.
I love all the Asian supermarkets.
Yes.
Especially, we live near that area in Westminster, in Orange County, where there's so many Vietnamese supermarkets that are so great to go to. I love all the produce there, and just how easy it is to just drive there and park and go inside. It's just very accessible. And I love the produce of California.
Oh, yeah, we're very lucky. So I have a last question to ask you. You have a new book coming out this year called Jacqueline in Paris. Can you give us any spoilers, or you're allowed to talk about it at all?
Yes. So Jacqueline in Paris, it's coming out on September 20th. And it is about the year Jacqueline Bouvier, so Jackie Kennedy.
Oh my God, wow. Okay, that's cool.
Spent in Paris as a student from 1949 to 1950. She was on exchange in Paris. This is before she had met Jack Kennedy or gotten married or anything. She was 20 years old. She traveled there with the Smith in Paris program and lived with a woman, a countess, and her two daughters, and then couple other students in a rambling apartment. Her host mother was actually a former resistance spy who had been captured and taken to Ravensbrück during the war. And the husband, the count, had died in a concentration camp. They were both resistance spies. So there was a sort of tragic mourning atmosphere in Paris at the time. It was, 5 years after the war, and people were still struggling with the ghosts of it. The political situation in Europe was quite fragile. It was the beginning of the Cold War. So there was a lot of tension between the Soviets and the rest of Europe, and, a lot of spying. And Jacqueline Kennedy later, for called it the happiest time of her life, the happiest year of her life, when she was, sort of carefree and there were no expectations. So this book it's fiction, but it's based on that year. And I was inspired by another travel story I wrote following in her footsteps there in Paris and visiting, I met with her former host sister, and I saw the building where she lived and went to Reed Hall, which is the Center for American Universities in Paris, and sort of retraced her path there. But because there's not, she's extremely private. So there are only a few tiny excerpts of her letters that exist or that, are available to the public. So it really gave me the opportunity to create a story of this young woman who is exploring, it's her intellectual and aesthetic awakening, really.
That sounds wonderful. I can't wait to get my hands on that. I can't wait till this comes out. This is going to be great.
Great. Well, I will definitely put you on the list and get an early copy sent to you.
Thank you. No, yeah. That's wonderful. Yeah, let's have you back on the show if you want. When it comes out, we can have you discuss the book, and
that would be awesome.
Promote that. I want to really thank you for being on the program. I've loved getting a chance to talk to you. Thank you for letting me nerd out and talk about the books, because I really love talking about your books, because they're so fun, and I just want to share them with everybody.
Well, thank you so much, Dean. This has really been a pleasure.
That was an encore presentation of my conversation with author Ann Ma, who's written Kitchn Chinese, The Lost Vintage, Instantly French, and has an upcoming book this year. This week, we'll be celebrating Asian American and Pacific Heritage Month all week, with many guests to follow. On Wednesday, we have Zine Ni of the vlog Zine in Real Life and Epic Eats. Both of them are really wonderful, and if you live in the Bay Area, are well worth your time. Not only are they informative, but they're also very entertaining. On Friday, we have author and food writer Carolyn Jung of Food Gal website and her numerous books and award-winning journalism pieces. If you follow my podcast and enjoy it, I'm on Buy Me a Coffee. You can buy me a coffee or a pint if you like, or leave feedback upon the link on the bio on this episode. If you want to help us promote this podcast and share this episode with a friend on social media, we really appreciate it. You can share on social media and tag us at Well Librarian on Twitter. Follow Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast on Spotify and get notified when new episodes are released. You can subscribe to the podcast newsletter and get updates on my articles and more at the link in the bio as well. And if you like the intro and outro piece, the theme Talk About Love is sung by the band Kitty Cat Fan Club. Their label Asian Man Records has given permission for its use. You can check out their website and buy albums by this band or other bands on the Asian Man record label at asianmanrecords.com. So I hope you are enjoying these encore presentation episodes. I had a blast recording them, and I hope you have a great rest of your week and talk to you tomorrow. Until then, keep cooking.